For viewers of the CBS soap opera As the World Turns, first word came at about 1:40 p.m. Eastern Time. It happened too quickly for cameras to be in place.
And I gave it a great deal of thought, Grandpa.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. This picture has just been transmitted by wire. It is a picture taken just a moment or two before the incident. If you can zoom in with that camera, we can get a closer look at this picture. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Hi, I'm Mason Joachim.
Hi, I'm Dolce Hillman.
Hi, I'm Tasia Bridges.
I'm Caitlin Elgin, and today we're presenting on our findings on how the assassination of John F. Kennedy affected the United States as a whole. Obviously, the assassination of a president is an impactful event in American history, and John Kennedy is no exception. But before we can look at how the American people reacted to the assassination, we must know how JFK got to where he was and why he was so popular. In 1946, John F. Kennedy won the election for the U.S. House of Representatives. He served 3 terms and got the reputation of being a conservative Democrat. In 1952, JFK ran for the U.S. Senate, and later, in 1956, JFK tried to be Adlai Stevenson's running mate. JFK did not run with Stevenson, and it was a good thing he did not. Stevenson did not win the presidency, and in 1960, JFK got the Democratic nomination for the presidency. Stevenson did not win the presidency, and in 1960, JFK got the Democratic nomination for the presidency and became one of the nation's most popular presidents, even though he didn't lead the country through war or make any big legislative advancements during his time in office, which, according to Sarah Nostel, these things play a big role in the popularity of presidents.
It was a mystery to most why John F. Kennedy was even elected president and how he stayed successful as this country's leader. In Baron's Lost World of John F. Kennedy, he states, end quote, as president, Kennedy had an air of command that kept his job ranking at an average of 71%. He was an exotic figure to most Americans, a young veteran of World War II when the White House had been held for 28 years by men born in the last part of the 19th century, a speaker with a butterscotch-thick Boston accent, thrusting his hands in his suit pockets like an English lord in a country whose favorite entertainment at the time was television westerns, a Roman Catholic in a nation over 2/3 non-Catholic, end quote, non-Catholic. Although he didn't directly mirror the majority of most Americans, what Kennedy did do was fulfill the country's need for a national purpose. After Eisenhower's presidency, which many saw as disconnect from the people, John F. Kennedy, from the start of his presidency, had big ideas for improving the lives of many Americans. Kennedy put plans in place for huge job growth. He promised a commitment to housing and education. He wanted to stimulate the short-term economy and even put federal power behind the Civil Rights Act. What the author suggests was so powerful about Kennedy's presidency was he wasn't trying to target one specific party or demographic, but wanted to positively impact anyone and everyone.
Now that we have more background on JFK's time as president, we can start to understand why he was such a beloved president at the time. The United States of America had had their fair share of heartbreak and loss, but nothing compares to the loss of our most trusted and powerful leader, our president. There have been only 4 times in American history that a president has been killed while in office. One of these presidents was good old Honest Abe. The most recent president was none other than John F. Kennedy. JFK was shot in the head and killed on Friday, November 22, 1963, at 12:30 p.m. in Dallas, Texas. The man responsible for his shooting did not only kill our president, but also a great part of this nation all at once. The shooter's name was Lee Harvey Oswald. This man never got to see justice due to the fact that he was shot and killed while being moved to a different prison. The news of John F. Kennedy's death was not only a shock to the nation but also to the world. Even though the news of his death got around the world fast, most people did not know what to do. Quote, "Nobody knew what the protocol is when a sitting president dies, so we occupied our mind with that, ... People would line up for days on end and blocks on end to sign them, millions of signatures," end quote. Not having a president was a shock to many, if not all, Americans. Quote, "If you think about it, presidents are like the constant in American history. No matter what is going on in the country and no matter how the country has changed over the time, there's always been a president serving since the United States became its own country," end quote. So when that constant was taken away from the American people, like in the case of John F. Kennedy, no one really knew how to react.
These 2 images were taken outside of Parkland Hospital, where John Kennedy was taken after he was shot. These pictures show the distress waiting to hear the news of whether the president was going to live or die. JFK's death had not even been announced yet, but as you can see from the pictures, people are already extremely heartbroken. What you can get from these pictures is that people of all nationalities, genders, and classes were somehow impacted by the news of the assassination. This picture shows a young girl sitting alone right outside of the memorial service held for President Kennedy a day after his death. Everyone was taking the news of Kennedy's death in different ways. The fact that this woman could not even make it into the memorial service because she was so upset shows how deeply Kennedy's death affected some people. Also, the background shows how many people came to the service as people are crowded around the doors. Even though Kennedy had just died, people were already looking for ways to make his memory last forever. Even though Kennedy was killed so early in his time of being a president, he is still one of the most well-known and loved presidents. John F. Kennedy's life and presidency is looked back upon fondly by a majority of the American people. What Kennedy installed in the country was a sense of trust and promise for a better government. According to David Greenberg, quote, "Under Kennedy, popular support for government was near its peak. More than 70% of Americans said they trusted Washington most or all of the time," end quote. Unfortunately, all the promise and hope JFK gave to the country was ripped away when he died. Ambassador Brandon H. Grove, Jr. had to say this about JFK's death. Quote, "When he died, so, once again, did all American innocence and a large piece of our native optimism. As individuals, we seem to have shorter time for being young," end quote.
you don't know how vulnerable you feel. It's like somebody coming into your house and robbing it. You suddenly feel, oh my God, I'm not even safe at home. I think that was kind of the feeling that people had, that sense of safety. Yeah, presidents can die, like FDR, but we hadn't had a president assassinated since McKinley in 1901, and we're talking 62 years between. So, for most people, they didn't have any recollection of that. It was, older people. You figure you'd have to be at least 5 or 10 years old at that time. So, approaching people 70 and older would have had memories of that. But for most Americans, it was just something that was completely shocking. There was a sense of, again, a lack of safety, a lack of what's going to happen in the future. People were afraid. They were looking at it and saying, gee, if the president can get hit. It was just the beginning, I think, of all the turmoil that came afterwards. When you think about the 60s, it's kind of hard to put yourself into it, but you have the Kennedy assassination, America's involvement in the war increases. You have civil rights, which is dividing the country. The South is breaking away from the Democratic Party. It is angry because the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act and major accomplishments of the time were seen as changing the status quo in the South, right? And we know it's a status quo change for the better. But when you change the status quo, it doesn't come without conflict. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of hatred. I think even more so than there is today at some of the Trump rallies. I mean, you just saw anger that was unfiltered. I remember watching, or at least I have memories of watching, the firemen putting hoses on African Americans, sicking dogs on African Americans who were protesting. I'm sure that I must have heard about all of the deaths of people going into the South. Everything that I heard about the South coming from Massachusetts was really negative. Nothing was enlightened about it. So it was almost as if there were two countries as well. There was the United States of America and there was the South. And the two were not, any closer to being together than they were during the Civil War when it was a Confederacy and the Union. Then when Vietnam became more violent and people began to ask questions about why are we there, what are we doing, what are we accomplishing, why did my son or my husband or my loved one die there? There were riots in the streets in a whole bunch of cities around the country, particularly in 67 and 68. Like I said, there were assassinations, and not just assassinations of the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King, but also assassinations of other African American leaders. It was Malcolm X was killed, and it was just a sense that. And now all of a sudden it was like presidents are liars. Presidents are cheats. They commit crimes. Some of them, like Gerald Ford, were just portrayed as being incredibly stupid. Jimmy Carter was portrayed as being too little for the office. When Reagan came along and Iran-Contra, there was talk of impeachment. There was such a relief among most of the country when it was determined that he was not directly involved, that he had not committed a crime. And, although it damaged his historical reputation and it damaged his approval ratings at the time, people wanted so much. And I think Reagan came along at a point where people just wanted a president to succeed, I remember reading editorials in the papers about that. We want you to succeed. I mean, it's a desperation. We're so tired of, Lyndon Johnson and Nixon and Ford and Carter. I mean, we've gone through the assassination of John Kennedy, and now it's like after almost 20 years of this misery, maybe finally we have somebody who we can look up to, who can hold the country together again. I don't think we still have gone back to the days where people looked up to an Eisenhower or a Kennedy.
Over half a century after his death, John F. Kennedy remains a powerful symbol of what could have been. Generations later, Kennedy's name still resonates as the charismatic, passionate president who could have transformed this nation had his life not been taken too soon. In Arlington National Cemetery, there is a memorial to commemorate his death called the Eternal Flame, which has been burning ever since it was lit to honor the president and represents how his legacy remains. In the eyes of the American people, Kennedy will forever serve as a symbol for promise and hope.